It's very easy for us to say, oh, I want to have this experience at the source. But are we actually supporting the communities, or are we sort of contributing to this extractive tourism? The lessons we learn from the indigenous way of working with plant medicine is this importance of community. We're not built to have a healing journey by ourselves and then deal with it by ourselves. And so community is also there to support. The power of bearing witness to an experience is unbelievable. The future is also this change and this shift into more of a systemic view, where these are a contribution for people to start seeing themselves and how they can be in service by working with these substances. How we can connect with the nature that is around us. That is the true essence, I believe, of reciprocity.
Hello, Amánda, and welcome to Existentia. Thank you so much for having accepted our invitation. Today, we are going to talk about the role of sacred plants in modern healing and in modern societies. As a start, we would like to know more about you and about your journey. Who was Amánda as a child, and who is Amánda now?
Yeah, so I grew up in New York, actually. I was raised an only child to a Brazilian mother and a Greek-American father. I always grew up feeling a bit different from other people in my community. I grew up outside New York City, and interestingly, as a child, I liked to play a lot with myself, perhaps because I didn't have siblings. I really enjoyed spending time outside in nature. I've always been connected with the natural world. I would say things started to be a little different for me when I was in my high school years. After the death of somebody very close to me, who I considered like a mother to me, things became challenging, and I started to suffer from bouts of depression and anxiety, and I didn't really know how to handle my emotions and to grieve this loss. And my parents did what they knew they thought was good for me, and they sent me to a psychiatrist because I was experiencing these feelings of depression and anxiety. And that's when I started on this road of pharmaceutical drugs to support my mental health. That was helping me to some extent, but it also wasn't. There was a lot of side effects from this. And so after university, when I went back to New York City and I was living in New York, I started to ask questions and started to inquire how I can actually make myself better, because I wasn't going to be taking these substances my whole life. That's just not what I saw my future to look like. And I met this amazing group of people when I was living in New York who were doing things differently. They were doing yoga, they were meditating, they were moving their bodies and doing something called 5 rhythms, ecstatic dance. They were living a more integrated life. They were combining their emotional and spiritual states with the day-to-day world. So I was really curious. I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting, and this is helping me. Getting in touch with my body again, really connecting with the parts of me that I had lost over these years, taking these antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. I just felt really disconnected from my body. And so I was doing all these practices that brought me back, and slowly my mental health started to improve. I started getting more interested and curious, and it was actually through this community that I first worked with plant medicines for the first time. And that journey was the start of a whole new life, and it informs what I do now and what I talk about now. And back then, it was very challenging to integrate that into my life because it was still so early. Not a lot of people understood what these altered states, these psychedelic states, these plant medicines can actually do for treating mental health and mental illnesses. And the experience opened the door. It didn't cure me. It didn't magically make all my depression, anxiety go away, but it really just allowed me to look at what was happening to me from in a different perspective. And it really gave me that autonomy and that confidence to look at the root causes, to really go after my healing process in a holistic way. And so this truly got me into this world of psychedelics, and I just became ever more curious and interested in how these can really help people the way it helped me.
Thank you for sharing. And you were already studying neuroscience, but then because you were suffering yourself from mental health issues, you were pushed to study more the mind because of that, or
how did it come? Yeah, so I was working in tech for many years while also working on healing my own mental health and to overcome this depression and this anxiety. And I was just, it wasn't, the picture wasn't complete for me just yet, because yes, I had this personal experience and I was experiencing all this change, but I really wanted to understand what was actually happening in my mind and to the brain while people undergo these altered states of consciousness experiences. And that's when I decided to, while working in tech, in the startup world, to also go back and to study neuroscience. And so when I did my master's degree in neuroscience, where I really looked at the effects of plant-based medicines and substances like psilocybin, together with psychotherapy for people with depression and anxiety and end-of-life related psychological distress. And so I was just curious, like, what's happening, essentially. The neuroscience was just a start, and it was just a way to sort of plant the seed. Then I started to work with a company that was investing in the psychedelic space. And so that is where I got involved in the business side of this industry, where I really had a bird's eye view of where the investments were being made into that sector, especially during this sort of bubble that we were having of major investments into drug development for psychedelic therapy, to different tech infrastructure that supports how people are being connected to these substances in a safe and regulated and legal, accessible way. And when I had this view of what's happening as an industry, and I just was able to see what was actually going on the inside, I saw that there was not a lot of conversation around the integration, which is what happens after people are having these experiences. Same thing goes with the clinical trials and the studies that I was doing in my research. It was just about the experience, the actual facilitation of that journey, but not about what happens after. And so that's when I was inspired to, after consulting with this company, to actually open my own, which is called Integra, which is really focused on supporting people to make meaning out of life's most transformational journeys, namely through this understanding around integration.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be interesting as well to touch the neuroscience aspect of it, if it makes sense for you. If you want to disclose a little bit what happening in the brain when we are under the influence of this kind of substances, it would be interesting.
Yeah, so from a neuroscience perspective, what we do know, obviously neuroscience, there's still so many unknowns and we're still uncovering a lot, but what we do know is that psychedelics have this capacity to induce neuroplasticity, which is this idea that the brain is generating new connections and new neurons over time. So it's inducing neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, and there are studies that actually have shown that, for example, with psilocybin, for example, there's multiple new connections that are being formed within the brain at a rapid pace when we're working with psychedelic states. And there are certain areas of the brain that are more affected. So there's an area called the default mode network, which is what we like to say the seat of the ego. It's this area that's responsible for self-referential thought, for introspection, for the sense of self, the I that is located in. And the default mode network can be very hyperactive with people who have depression and anxiety. For me, for example, when I was experiencing this anxiety, I was just constantly overthinking. I was ruminating on ideas, and I couldn't stop thinking. My brain was just in overdrive. And these psychedelic states actually have the capacity to reduce activity within the default mode network while increasing functional activity between brain regions. So the default mode network and other regions are increasing in activity, so you're getting much more connections, while within the default mode network, there's sort of a reduction in activity, which means that there's a bit more ease, a bit more of this idea that we can relax into states and have a more of a non-identification with being so hyperactive, so depressed. And so there are other studies that show reduction in activity in the amygdala, for example, which is that reptilian seat of the reptilian brain, which is hyperactive in a fight or flight response. So if you have a lion that's in front of you, what do? You run away, because that's this evolutionary part of you that knows that it needs to run away from danger. And for people with generalized anxiety disorder or other forms of anxiety disorders, that is just very active. You're constantly reacting to external stimuli in a hyperactive way. And so psychedelics are also shown to reduce activity in the amygdala. It reduces our stress response, our cortisol levels.
Makes sense. What do you think all this substance could add on the traditional kind of conventional psychotherapy?
Conventional medicine normally treats symptoms, treats illnesses. Conventional medicine is based on somebody already having something, and there's a problem that needs to be fixed and to be solved. I went through it myself. I had symptoms of depression and anxiety, and I had to take pharmaceutical psychiatric medication to solve and to treat my symptoms. I see psychedelics and these altered states, experiences, and modalities as a way to bring in prevention and to make people continue to be well, to maintain wellness. I see it as psychedelic wellness. And so it's two very different ways of seeing the treatment model and the healthcare model. Currently, in clinical trials, we are using it as a treatment for existing indications, like MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, ketamine for treatment-resistant depression, for other types of things like chronic pain, substance use disorders, eating disorders, smoking addiction, alcohol addiction. These are all existing indications that these treatments are being studied, because that is what the medical model can show us, and that's how things move through clinical trials to be able to support them. And that is wonderful, and I feel that that's really important and needed. And I also see how we need to start looking at these substances as a supportive tool, one of many different modalities, because this is not the magic pill, silver bullet for treatment of all types of indications, but as one of the puzzle pieces to the larger picture of integrated well-being and whole well-being, whether it be our nutrition, our lifestyle, the amount of sleep, the amount of exercise we get, our interpersonal relationships, the community support and service that we have, our purpose professionally, personally, our family systems, all of this contributes to our mental well-being. And so I see psychedelics as one of the possibilities, and not the only, and not for everyone, but one of the possibilities for that to be integrated into the health system. Now, I think we're very far off from that right now, because we're still very much focused on it as a treatment-only model for symptoms and for mental illness, that indicators that are existing currently within that.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. Mm-hmm. And now, if you can explain a little bit on the books that were transformative for you during your life and during your journey, if you want to mention one or two of them.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Well, this one, it's called Daring Greatly: How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead, by Brené Brown. You can see I like to read and put little notes, because it just means I'm paying close attention. This book came to me when I was living in Berlin, and I wasn't yet working in the space or talking about psychedelics openly, or this was before I even started my neuroscience degree. This was like really, really early. But it was by this woman, Brene. I don't know if you know her. She's amazing. She's one of my heroes. Just because she's an academic, she's a researcher. She studies vulnerability. She studies how people experience the world, essentially. And she, for me, was one of the first people to make it mainstream to talk about their inner world in a way that people felt like they could relate to, and there wasn't a stigma attached to it. And it was actually very empowering and very grounded in her approach. So she talked about how being vulnerable is actually one of the greatest gifts that we can have. And it helps other people feel safe to also be themselves and be authentic. And this courage that it takes to do that is not something to take advantage of and to take for granted, essentially. And so when I read this, I was like, okay, there's somebody else who speaks my language and who can put a language to it that is really widely accepted, because she's really well known. And she's a great speaker. Like, she's one of the first people, when I saw her speak on TED, I was like, okay, I want to be like her. I want to be able to articulate my vision the way she does. She also does it with a little bit of humor. And so, yeah, this book really changed a lot for me. The other book, you also see there's also more of these. The Body Keeps the Score, Mind, Brain, and Body in the Transformation of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk. So it's funny, he wrote this book and then nobody knew about it. And years later, when this topic of trauma and how it's related to what happens in the body, people started to understand the importance of this, and then it became a best-selling sensation. And this was also something I came across early in my life, around the same time that I uncovered other books, again, before I studied neuroscience, before I got into this. A person who talked about mental health, not just through the changes that are happening in the brain or in our mental capacities. He, for me, talks about how traumas that's stored in the body are actually contributors to our mental health issues that we might have. So as someone like me who had experienced depression and anxiety early on in life, I was able to understand that from a different lens, not just through maybe the chemical changes that are happening in my brain, or not just a brain disease. It's not that. It's actually how we can also uncover the disconnection or understand mental illness as a disconnection from our body. And so he just talked about trauma in a way that really spoke to me. And it also made me realize that when I want to support people on their integration process now, which is what I do as a coach and as an advocate for integrating these altered states experiences, how important it is to bring the body into the equation and to harmonize the body with the mind and the spirit and our emotional state to create this really holistic, integrated view of healing. The next book, should I do the third one?
Yeah.
I've just finished this book, and it's called We Will Be Jaguars by Nemote Nenkimo. And it's a memoir of this woman's life. She's from the Waorani community in Ecuador, in the Amazon, and she's indigenous. And I actually met her at Climate Week in New York this past September, and she signed it for me, which is really amazing, and super happy to have met her. And she's really an inspiration because she is an advocate and an activist for the protecting of her community and her lands. And she is a steward of indigenous culture and sacred plants. And although she herself is not an elder and a facilitator of sacred plant medicines like ayahuasca or whatnot, she comes from a part of the world where these plants are used as medicines and as a way of life and a cultural identity. And in Ecuador and Brazil and Colombia and Peru, ayahuasca is obviously very much an important part of many of these cultures. And so I came through to understand indigenous life by being exposed to these medicines in the forest. And I started to connect with these communities that are living integrated with the natural world. And so a big part of what I do now is really try and translate the learnings and the lessons that we can receive from these indigenous leaders and these activists and these storytellers, and also try and understand that the way that they actually relate with nature as a part of the understanding of self. So this is why I feel really inspired by this book, and I encourage people to read stories about communities and groups that they don't know much about, so that they can really have an understanding of how they see themselves within society.
No, thank you for bringing this book, because it's doing a bridge for the topic that we wanted to tackle with you. How do you think these traditional practices that we see mostly in these ancient contexts, in these societies, can be brought to our modern society and still be respectful of those communities?
Yeah, we can really make a bridge here, and I believe that bridge needs to be built with time and with care and integrity, and the deep awareness that now that these substances, these plant medicines like ayahuasca, peyote, even rapé, which is that sacred tobacco, psilocybin, all of these natural plant-based, fungi-based medicines that are stewarded by communities that have been working with these medicines for much, much longer, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's so trendy right now. All of a sudden, we want to take part in this. And we need to also be very aware of what the consequences might be for some of these communities that are working with these as part of their life and their culture. How we can do that is obviously really making sure that we're understanding what our individual behaviors, how they affect these communities, to make sure we're not being extractive directly of the plants and the actual medicines that they're coming from, but also being extractive and appropriating the culture or the way of being. You know, how do we dress? Are we wearing feathers, or are we singing their songs and without really understanding where the music comes from, or telling their stories without even attributing the actual people who are voicing those stories? And so it's very easy for us now. I think we're seeing a lot of New Age shamans or people who are doing these plant medicines, and they may very well be studying under a lineage that's not necessarily their own. They don't come from the place in which they're learning these traditions. So that's a very interesting question, right? So someone who's grew up in my situation, I am a Brazilian woman, but I'm also, I didn't grow up in the forest. I actually grew up in the States, but someone who grew up in in the city somewhere in Europe or in the United States or even in South America, but they don't come from these places. They're not indigenous to the places where these substances and these medicines are actually used. How can you now be part of that in a way that's not extractive? These are questions that I often have, and they're questions that came up a lot in the nonprofit that I was supporting for a couple of years called El Puente Foundation, where we went in and we were trying to make those bridges between these communities and the modern applications of these as a therapeutic and even clinical treatment for people. And so when we think about being in right relationship and in really supporting the flourishing, it's not just about, yes, there is of course the direct regeneration and preservation of the bioculture of the ayahuasca vines, even, making sure that they're being replanted, not just ayahuasca, but also the master plants, the other teacher plants that exist in the forest, so that we can ensure that those people who are the guardians, the rightful guardians of these forests, can be enabled to continue to protect them. So we have also the ecological and the environmental ways that we can be in support, but there's also the cultural and societal ways to help preserve their language and their culture. But what does that mean for us living here? I live in Portugal. Anyone who's working with psychedelics or plant medicines, but they want to be in relationship or they want to make sure that they can be in service, it's a little more subtle than that, right? So we're not just talking about, yes, we can be giving money to these causes, but the more interesting part is in our integration of the work, which is how we can connect with the nature that is around us, how we can be in service to the land that we are on now. So once I was at a conference where an amazing activist from Brazil, Chay Surui, she's from Rondônia, and she was talking about what's happening in Brazil with the logging and the extraction and her forests being cut down. And someone in the audience asked her, so what can I do to help you? How can I help you? I'm feeling so connected to this. And she says, I don't need any help in Brazil right now. I'm enabled to protect my own land. The thing that you can do is to start to become aware of the land that you are on, and how can you be in service to that? So she asks us all to say, okay, where do I live here, and how can I support locally? How can I make sure that there's gardens and forests and that we're replanting here? How can I ensure that I'm properly contributing to the groups that are advocating for clean air, renewable energy, recycling our plastics, all of these things, right? How can I connect with the elements that are close to me to protect our oceans or our rivers? Maybe we're in Portugal, it's more interesting to be connected to the coastline, right? What's happening with the oceans? We don't have big, huge forests, right? But we have water that we need to protect. And so being in right relationship doesn't necessarily mean being directly connected to these communities, but it does mean being in relationship with the environment that we're in. And that's our way of being in service when we're working with these altered states, I feel.
It's such a complete answer. And I think it's really to start by what's around us rather than trying to help the other side of the world. And this is, I think, a very humble lesson. Psychedelic assisted therapy is already taken place at this in Portugal, but it's healing here. How do you envision this happening without disarming this kind of communities? And if the ayahuasca would enter in the conventional, traditional mental health setting?
Yeah, the question of whether a traditional medicine can work with the modern system like ayahuasca, for example, I don't see how that can be reconciled in a clinic as a clinical treatment, because ayahuasca is not just the combination of the Banisteriopsis caapi vine and the chacruna plant done with a very particular way of brewing this. It's not just the brew, it's not just the combination of these two plants and then you take it and that's it, right? Ayahuasca is a cultural phenomena. It's a spiritual container with the music, the way of the ceremony, the rituals that are also ayahuasca is different across many different communities. There's no one ayahuasca and there's no one ayahuasca ceremony. So to say that we would take that and bring it to a clinician's office and just give somebody ayahuasca and for 8 hours they go through an experience while we play a playlist, I don't see that possible at all. It's two different worlds. Now, there is a possibility, of course. We see it, as you say, in Portugal. Ketamine-assisted therapy is legal. It's also legal in the United States. And it's being used very effectively for many people who are working through depression and other mental health issues. And it's administered by a clinician. It's also a substance that is synthesized and that lends itself very well for a clinical application. So that one seems more obvious. But then we have a very interesting point around mushrooms, around psilocybin, which grows naturally. And what's interesting about psilocybin is that, yes, there is a history of indigenous stewardship with the Mazatec people in Mexico. In Oaxaca, you hear of Maria Sabina, who's the first to kind of bring the substance to the Western psyche. Gordon Wasson went there to visit Maria Sabina, and then he came back and was talking about how wonderful this experience was, and he kind of brought mushrooms to the West. But they can be grown anywhere, and they've actually been used in other indigenous contexts. You have Amanita muscaria from the north that are stewarded by the Sami people, and mushrooms have now been synthesized and administered in pill form as an analog of that psilocybin for therapeutic use. So that's a really interesting combination of having historical indigenous tradition and clinical application. I feel that that one is a much easier bridge to be made because it can be grown anywhere. It can be used and created and kind of take on the form of healing from whoever is working with that particular substance. They take on the energy or the spirit of the person that grows it. And so if the intention of working with that mushroom is more of a clinical intention, it'll take on a very different way of being applied than somebody who, let's say, grows it in their backyard and is connecting with it with a more spiritual dimension and all of that. So I do feel that mushrooms are a really good way for us to make that bridge. It just comes with a lot of awareness. Now, how we can work with that while still being in right relationship with communities that have stewarded this as part of their culture is to firstly become very aware of what is actually their culture and what is your appropriation of it or your interpretation of it. The medical model is an entirely different model. And so as long as you understand the context in which you're working with the substance, and you understand that when you're doing so in a medicalized context, you are not engaging in a more spiritual container or a ceremonial container. It's not with the same music, it's not with the same setting. The space and the energetics are completely different. So I don't have like a full answer. I believe that it's really important that we use, that we have access to psychedelic mushrooms with mushrooms for clinical use. I also believe it's important, though, that we make a distinction between what is clinical and what's not. And in the cases of the ceremonial use of ayahuasca, I don't see that bridging into a clinical setting for so many reasons. Also from purely the substance itself, the extraction of that. There are companies that are obviously making synthetic analogs of DMT, but that's not an ayahuasca trip. That's a DMT clinical treatment using DMT. And that has nothing to do with the cultures and the environment in which that ayahuasca is brewed and made.
Could be a more difficult example to kind of synthesize and put it in a pill. So now looking a little bit for the other side and trying to understand a little bit the risks, what would be in your the dangers of seeking to have these altered states experiences, particularly trying to have those experiences outside of a non-traditional context setting?
Yeah, there's always risks with these experiences, no matter whether you're doing them in your own backyard or with in a clinical setting or in a ceremonial context. Now that these experiences are becoming so hyped up and so trendy, and we're hearing stories of people go so far away to have them, is very frankly that we are completely out of our environment and our comfort zone when we are going from, let's say, a city environment all the way across the world to a forest to take part in an experience with communities that we don't have any relationship with, in a culture we don't understand, in a language that's being spoken that we don't understand, with rituals that are not ours and that we have no familiarity with. So that puts us, we're already in such a vulnerable state when we're working with these altered states experiences. Now, to take us in that vulnerable state and plant us into an environment that's not ours, and where we don't have the resources already in place to support us should something go wrong, there are dangers with that. There are risks involved. It's very easy for us to say, oh, I want to have this experience at the source. But how much is that actually going to be supporting you? While also, let's think about the carbon footprint to get there. So we want to be supporting our forests and be in reciprocity, but we're also spending a lot of resources to get there. And are we actually supporting the communities that are offering these, or are we sort of contributing to this extractive tourism? In Peru, for example, there's this, what came up was this concept of ayahuasca tourism, where you could just see, and I was there myself in Iquitos, which is sort of the base of operations for many of these medicine journeys. And I just saw how this Aya tourism over the years completely destroyed the city. People, these fake shamans would come up and start offering these things to tourists who are just looking to do a ceremony because they heard about it, right? So you're also seeing the consequences of what might happen if all of a sudden we all just went there. So it's not just our individual potential risks where we could have a very challenging experience and not know what to do about it. It could be potentially more traumatizing than helpful, but also the societal risks, the sociocultural and economic risks that can come from going straight to the origin, right? So there are risks with that. And it's also important to understand that when we're outside of that environment, and let's say people are seeking underground experiences more locally with an underground facilitator, of course, it's not legal, first of all. But let's say they're in an environment where there's some regulation and they're part of an ayahuasca church, for example. In the United States, there are legal ways to work with ayahuasca if you're part of a spiritual or religious entity. There are questions around where is that substance coming from? So is that facilitator or spiritual leader or shaman or whatever they call themselves, are they actually sourcing that medicine themselves? So that's an interesting part in terms of our the extractive element and the dangers there, right? So we need to ask ourselves, where is this coming from? Is this implicating somebody to take this across borders illegally, for example? Do they have a direct relationship with the preparation of that medicine? And how is that going to affect your own experience with it? So there's also very subtle differences there that could be risky. And the very general risk of, you're in an experience that is completely novel to you. And without the appropriate preparation and integration, you can have adverse effects, re-traumatization. You don't take part in a society that already integrates these experiences as part of their day-to-day life. So with indigenous communities that work with sacred plants as part of their identity and culture, their life is already integrated because not only are they in a natural setting where they can go and be more connected with the environment that's supporting them, but their tribe is working with these medicines and is aware of them since they were young. It's part of their community way of life. We don't have that. Many of us are doing this without sharing with our family or friends. Many of us are doing this sort of as a last resort, or as, there's so much need for treatment and for support, but they don't know where to go, and they've heard that maybe ayahuasca can support them, or peyote, or mushrooms, and then they go and they do these mushrooms, but then they don't have anyone to turn to. So the big thing, the lessons we learn from the indigenous way of working with plant medicine is this importance of community, and why community is so, so important. We don't do these processes alone. We're not built to have a healing journey by ourselves and then deal with it by ourselves. And so community is also there to support somebody's entire journey, to witness. The power of bearing witness to an experience is unbelievable, because you have someone who is there for you and who is there to see you in your entire journey and to step in and to reflect back when the time is right, to encourage, to hold someone accountable, to share when somebody might be steering off into another way, and to say, no, come back. Like I've seen you, I've seen where you've come, and I see where you're going. And to really be part of that person's journey. And that is where it's so profound in these traditional settings, where it's intergenerational, from the child all the way through to the elder, and the importance of having the mirror and the reflection of an elder who's been through it all to be able to share their wisdom and to mentor and to teach is also something that we have less access to when we're talking about these experiences. These altered states experiences don't have a lineage for us. Oftentimes, we don't have our parents, grandparents, or our teachers that have worked with these experiences who know how to make sense of it and who can teach us the right way. And so the risk is that people are not finding the right support for that process, which is all the reason why integration is so important.
I was thinking that for someone that is viewing the interview can be interesting, which is piece of advice from you. Would you recommend this type of experiences to just a curious about the mind and the curious to explore consciousness? Or you would just recommend for someone that is actually dealing with struggles and trying to use these substances to help him heal? What is your view on this?
Yeah, in the spirit of what we were talking about, how I see this as really a prevention tool rather than just treatment of existing mental illness, for example, or for other physical conditions. These psychedelic states or these altered states of experiences, I believe, are really interesting avenues for people who are just curious about these modalities. They might be curious about how they can be more connected, right? How they can improve their creativity, their productivity, their performance, improve their relationships. Maybe they want to feel more spiritually connected to something greater than themselves. Maybe they want to have a greater connection with nature and the natural world. I do recommend this as an option for some people. It's not for everyone. It really depends on their history and how familiar and comfortable they are already with introspection, with stillness, with sitting with themselves for periods of time. And also, I will, of course, always state that these need to be done in a regulated and legal context. So if it's not with substances, there are many non-substance induced altered states, let's say for breathwork, for example. Before engaging in a very advanced breathwork practice, how comfortable are they with letting go of control? How comfortable are people with the unknown, with surrender, with just really letting the process take over, right? And so they may not be ready for something so confronting as that, because it's not so easy as just, we just take a pill or have a breathwork journey and all of a sudden we're going to reach these peak states. It takes an enormous amount of preparation, mental preparation, emotional preparation, physical preparation. So my advice for people who are just curious, it's to start to research about these substances, but also to inquire with the self. How comfortable are they with going on a journey that is about uncovering things that maybe they don't even know exist within them? And that is a process, of course.
Good pieces of advice. I think now stepping into the final chapter of this interview, I think it's at our own time. So starting with the perspective of the future of this area, how do you see the future of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, and especially in the rise of all these complementary healing approaches?
I see the future of this space, specifically with psychedelic substances, as one of the modalities that people can have safe, legal, accessible access to in their preventative well-being journey. So I do believe that the future will include different protocols for individuals who are experiencing different forms of mental, physical, and emotional distress, whether they be mental illnesses like PTSD, but also chronic pain, or people who have traumatic brain injury, or people who have eating disorders. There's a whole range of different indications that these substances can support, and I do see a future in that. More importantly, what I see is this: as we have more awareness of what these can do for our whole entire being and for our integrated life, is that there's more connection with that as an area of well-being. And that doesn't mean people are going to start going and tripping on mushrooms every weekend in order to stay well. I actually don't believe that psychedelics are the best way or the only way that we can achieve what we're looking for. They're just one of the ways of access. And this for me is the future, where truly and wholly the end result is that people are just more connected to themselves and to others, and they feel this intrinsic connection with their natural surroundings so that they feel more inclined to protect the planet that we live in, right? So the future is also this change and this shift in the mentality or the idea that psychedelics are for individual and personal growth and transformation, which they are, but we shift into more of a systemic view where these are a contribution for people to start seeing themselves and their sense of purpose within the world and how they can be in service and in contribution to that world. That is the true essence, I believe, of reciprocity. So how we can actually be in service by working with these substances.
Definitely. Now, thinking in a broader perspective on consciousness and what does this complex word means, how do you think this kind of experiences, altered states experiences, can help us understanding better the concept of consciousness and what the mind is and subconscious?
What I love about this whole advent of psychedelic states and all these altered states, and what I love the most is that we're actually questioning things like this, like what is consciousness? We're getting curious about it. We're all very much students in all of this. I don't believe that anyone has one right answer as to what is consciousness. I know that we see consciousness as connected with the mind and mind-based processes, though I'm not fully convinced that that's the whole answer. That's just one dimension. This idea that consciousness is the ability to witness oneself in an experience, the witness of the witnessing. It's like a multi-layered, I'm here observing my own experience, therefore I am conscious of it. Yes, that's part of it. I do believe that ability to perceive and observe and sort of take oneself out of the body, even to observe where we are in our relation to space. Though I also believe that there's another type of consciousness that exists that is subtle and unseen, that directs a lot of the way we move through the world. And just understanding the mind is not going to get us to the full crux of what consciousness might be. And it involves potentially even the definition of what a psychedelic really is. So psychedelic, as originally coined by Humphrey Osmond in 1957, I believe, he called it originally mind manifesting because he took two words, psyche, and delun, delic, two Greek words. And delun means to manifest or to reveal. But psyche, if you ask a Greek person, the true definition is not just mind. It's not mind manifesting. It's actually a representation of the soul. And so psychedelic is a revealing of one's soul. And so how can we actually uncover and understand what that definition might really be as it connects to our own consciousness? Perhaps the soul is part of the conscious state of being. That could be my understanding of it. It's a bit more philosophical, a bit more non-defined. But we're all here because we're all curious about connecting to something bigger than ourselves. And maybe the collective consciousness is here to awaken something within us that needs to be awakened to reveal our soul's true purpose in this world.
And one of the last questions, I think the last question would be how you deal with this, not knowing what consciousness is or exploring these realms. How do you deal with the mystery of light in general?
How do I deal with the mystery of life? I wish I could say I had some kind of a magic formula. I know that it's very easy for somebody to go to the top of the mountain and meditate and be a monk and just sit and be in bliss all day. But that's not how life works for most of us. We have to come down the mountain and to be in the world and to be in the world truly. And I do that by acknowledging my humanness every single day. We all make mistakes. We all know something. We all can know a lot and have a lot of wisdom, and we can also make the same mistakes we've been making our whole life. So how do I deal with this unknown? Staying very, very curious, having a beginner's mind, as the Zen Buddhists like to say, retaining that beginner's mind of just always seeing things and having the humility to know that we don't know everything and that we'll never know all of it. Entering these realms of altered states of consciousness is a true privilege that we have because we are given the ability to navigate ourselves in a unique way. We don't need to do that in order to still stay curious, to have this incredible experience that is life. And so being a student always of the mystery is my way of doing so. Yeah.
I think I can end like this. What would be the potential that you see for humanity if we continue to explore this even realms of the mind, potentially through psychedelics and altered states?
The exploration for humanity, the potential is infinite. The potential is absolutely infinite. We all have a responsibility to harness this potential and to work with it in deep service so that we are supporting the flourishing of humanity and not destroying it. So the potential is also so high that we can also go the other way and we can destroy if we don't be careful. And the same goes with how we work with these altered states. With this privilege, with this gift comes that responsibility. And so the potential can be wonderful and great. And if we can all feel more unity and connected to one another and to get closer to that sense of purpose, I believe that we're on the right track.